All right. Let's see here. Waiting for the slides. Okay, so my name is Kent Bai, and I'm going to be talking to you today about the transformative potential of XR. This says VR, but that's just because I mostly focus on virtual reality, but I think a lot of what I'm talking about is also about XR as well. And so I'm going to be talking about some of the specific transformative VR experiences that I've had, and then talk a bit about what is transformation. We're here at Games for Change, XR for Change. What is change? What is it that we're going from and into? What's a model for transformation? And then finally, I'm just going to have a brief time to be able to talk just a short bit about my experiential design framework. So at the Voices of VR podcast, I've gone to over 80 different conferences over the last 5 years, done over, at this point, probably over 1,200 interviews, really looking at this medium as it's changing and evolving. And it's given me this opportunity to ask a lot of people what they think where this is all going. And I asked them what the ultimate potential of XR is. And so their answers tend to land into one of these different domains of human experience, whether they say it's going to be entertainment or medicine or being able to connect to their relationships and partners, their family, their career, higher education, early education, identity, embodiment. So typically, this is like a cartography of the human experience. So people usually answer in one of those ways. But when people ask me what I think what the ultimate potential of VR is, I kind of go into the major axes between the self and other, private and public, which is so the ultimate potential of XR for me is that you're able to connect to yourself, connect to other people, connect to the planet, and connect to all levels of reality. So I'm going to go through some of the experiences that I've had over the last 5 years that I think kind of illustrates what I mean here specifically. So here's some examples. So an example of connecting to yourself. So at Tribeca this year, there was a piece called The Collider. And when you go into Collider, two people go in. It's an asymmetric experience. So one person's in VR and the other person's not in VR. But what they ask you to do is, for each person, they ask you to recall a memory of when you either had someone have power over you or you had power over somebody else. So then you go into this experience, and the person who is in VR, who has this memory of someone else controlling them, they're literally being puppeteered by you, and you're sort of controlling them. And then you have this sort of psychoactive, like you're invoking the memory from your own life. Then you have this kind of ritualistic VR experience, and then you're asked to talk to each other at the end. So it's some ways you're architecting an experience to have a conversation, but those conversations are drawing upon your own memories. And I think that's a theme that I see that, if you're going to do immersive storytelling and you're going to be the protagonist, then how do you have someone go through a certain amount of change in 40 minutes? That's the challenge. And the only way to do that is for you to be asked to bring parts of yourself into the experience. And I think the Collider did a great job of doing that. The other thing is Google Earth VR, which is very similar. And how many people have done Google Earth VR? I'm just curious. And how many of you gone to places where you grew up? You start to have the architecture of these spaces, and you start to have your own memories come up. And I went through and actually kind of went to all these hotspots of where I grew up, and I was able to map the emotional architecture of my life in Google Earth. And I was able to have an understanding about my hometown in a way that I never had before. So that's another example of how these immersive technologies are able to allow us to understand parts about ourselves that we may have not known before. So connecting to other people, I think a lot of people in this room would have a lot of examples of empathy and virtual reality. And so Testimony VR is an amazing experience where Zohar Kafir did a lot of different interviews with women who were sharing their experiences of sexual assault. And it's a whole entire context and an environment where you sit and you can bear witness to these stories. And so you're using virtual reality to be able to create a context, to be able to listen to something that may be way too overwhelming for you to just watch on a 2D screen. It's creating this safe container, and then if any moment it gets too intense for you, you can look away and it'll stop. And so it's embedded within it a way to be able to do this truth and reconciliation and be able to actually, as an experiencer, bear witness to immense trauma. So that, I think, is promising. We're certainly not lacking in any trauma right now. Traveling While Black is showing here. If anybody has a chance to see it, definitely try to see it. It's 25 minutes. I'd recommend people having plenty of opportunity to see the whole experience. But again, it's an amazing experience because it creates a context for people to share their own lived experiences. And you're able to, through this experience, as a ghost, kind of enter into a circle and listen to a conversation that if you were there in real life, you may actually change the conversation because it's all these people of color who have this shared experience of what it means to travel while black. They did a whole number of different parts of it, but in this specific instance, it's the mother of Tamir Rice who's sharing the story for the first time publicly about what happened to her son. And you can bear witness to that. So again, it's this being able to bear witness and to create a context to be able to have people share their context of what it means, but you're able to, as a ghost, enter in and bear witness and understand it. And I think this is, in a lot of ways, a mechanism to be able to build empathy. And then finally, I'd say this experience called The Key, it won the Storyscapes. So why did it win Storyscapes? Well, Celine Tricart, the creator of this piece, she's a lucid dreamer. And so she uses dreams and dream logic in this experience to create this metaphor that is very similar to what Jordan Peele's been doing with Get Out and Us, where it's like this deep metaphor. You see what's happening in the symbols of the movie, but there's a lot of meaning behind it. And in this specific case, it's like you're in this dream and you're interacting and you're doing these different things, and then at the end, she sort of unlocks what the metaphor is, and it was so powerful. It's one of the most powerful experiences that I've had within virtual reality. And I'll let people see the experience for yourselves, and I have an interview with Celine that I'll be putting on the podcast at some point that unpacks a lot of the way that she did that. But using dream logic and metaphors and spatial metaphors and kind of, again, ritualistic embodiments that have deeper meaning, they actually have impact on what the story that's trying to be told. Connecting to the planet. So a couple of years ago at Sundance, there's an experience called Operation Aspen, and it was by Condition One, and they did this invasion, or like this, I guess it's direct action by going into this animal, this series of caged chickens, and they had a doctor there that was giving a guided tour and basically pulling out chickens and saying, well, this chicken's about to die, and in these conditions, and it's so long, they just walk the entire length. And after this experience, it just really stuck with me. And I was at Sundance, and I had to go to the grocery store and buy eggs. And so when I was sitting there, about to buy cage-free eggs or not, I made a different decision. I had a connection to what was previously unseen. I was able to make the connection between things that were invisible and to connect the dots between the unintended consequences of that consumer decision that I made, and it changed my decision. And I think, to me, that is one of the most encouraging things I could think of, because the power of how many unseen things are there in the world and how many different ways can we connect the dots about these little consumer actions that we have, can we connect those dots and to be able to have people make different choices, because that's how we're going to bring change, is to have individuals make different choices. And then connecting to all levels of reality. This is sort of like everything else, and I think you can look at art and tilt brush, and I think of it as like the platonic realms of reality that you're starting to overlay onto reality, whether through augmentation, or you're able to shift context or do this symbolic movement of art to be able to bring about deeper meaning to what you're looking at. And what I've noticed within AR art is that you see a piece of art, and then you turn on the AR filter, and then, you see something else, and then you turn it off, and then wow, you see it completely in a different way. So augmented reality is going to be able to allow you to do some sort of art piece that is able to recontextualize and have people see reality in new ways. And Beat Saber is a game that I've had lots of just sort of transcendent experiences of getting into flow states, and I feel like I'm able to tap into dimensions of my character and personality within these immersive experiences and go into these flow states and to be able to tap in and to experience things that I am not able to do in the mundane world. So those are the transformative experiences. So I just want to dive in briefly into some of the, what is transformation? So we all are familiar with Campbell's hero's journey, where you're in the known world, you go into the unknown world, so you're making that cross into the threshold, and then you have the some sort of challenge, an ordeal that you have to overcome, and then once you change a part of your character, then you come back and you are giving back to the community the things that you've learned. And so the Institute of Noetic Sciences also has a very similar process, which is like in the process of spiritual transformation, you are having your own inner noetic experiences, you're exploring, you find a daily practice, but eventually once you get into that practice, there's this shift from I to we, where you're not only just focusing on what you're doing as an individual, but you're thinking about how can I contribute to what's happening in the collective. And so it's going from the individual transformation to collective transformation. And if we look at like Kuhn in the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, there's this cycle where you have a paradigm, and then you have like a whole science and all the models, but then there's an anomaly, and that anomaly doesn't fit within the paradigm. And that either you ignore the anomaly because it just is extraneous and it doesn't like merit you changing your paradigm, or if it's persistent enough of an anomaly, then you have to like change your paradigm. You have to come up with some sort of new model that encompasses this anomalous information, and then it just sort of happens all over again. And that's the process of science. But there's a whole sociological aspect to that paradigm shift, that there's always going to be information that's ahead of the curve before it gets accepted by the collective. Now, there's an author named Arthur Young. He was actually the founder of Bell Helicopter. And in his book, The Geometry of Meaning, he has this kind of interesting spectrum between individual and collective and subjective and objective. And so he has this kind of, the individual objective are the facts, and then you have knowledge, and then you have intuitions and beliefs. And I was having some debates about this with some friends, and we were talking about, well, what is belief? What is knowledge? Because in some sense, we're in this world of beliefs versus knowledge. It's like a war between what is real and what is just fake and propaganda, what is coming from objective facts that can be proved by science versus what is your belief. And that may come from your lived experience, which may be non-falsifiable. And so how do you manage these things? And in some ways, our brain may not make any differentiation between fact and belief and knowledge and intuition at all. It could just be a part of our experience. And so how do we navigate this? I think that's like one of the big questions of our day. So I like to say that every immersive experience is like a philosophical argument. Like you were trying to argue for something, and you're trying to give someone a lived experience, and that from that lived experience, they could then change their behavior or change the way that they see the world. And that's sort of like the ideal outcome of transformation, is that you have an intention for your model of what you think is happening in the world. You create an experience, and people go through it, and then they're able to understand your model or your way of seeing, and they're maybe actually like see the consequences of their actions into the world. And I was at this neuroscience conference, and there was one of the neuroscientists were talking about how the past model of neuroscience used to be like that there's the world that's out there, then there's a sensation, and then there's ourself, and then perception, and there's this loop, but that more and more they're moving into like, well, the perception and your sense of self and the world are kind of all blended together in this, what he would call like the predictive coding model of neuroscience, which is that whenever you're perceiving something, you're not just perceiving what's there, you're taking all of your prior lived experiences that you have about that, and you're projecting it onto that, and there's a fusion of what you're observing in that moment, and you have like this error, this like prediction error coding that is this feedback loop between that. And so you have your expectations, but then you have your lived experience. But the point is that there's this big mess of lived experience of our entire life that is constantly being compared to what we expect and our beliefs. So our worldview and our beliefs are actually directly impacting to our nature of perception, which I think is pretty radical when you start to think about now being able to control all different dimensions of that perception with immersive technologies. So the Oatmeal did this great comic and talking about the Backfire Effect, and this is his depiction of your religion, your tradition, your family, your life experiences. It's like this house that's there, and then you have something that is information that's anomalous, it doesn't fit into your house, and then it sort of like wants to destroy all of your house, and then your house is like starting to fall apart. And then your brain's like, no, don't come in here, and we're gonna like basically fortify that information, because it's very disruptive to have somebody come in and say your worldview is wrong, because then you have to kind of reevaluate everything. So this is kind of like the challenge of whenever you're talking about transformation, is that you're presenting information that may be going against somebody's worldview, and it's kind of disruptive to destroy somebody's house. But there's this, we've all heard this Gandhi quote of first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. Well, that's a part of that paradigm change, is that there's always going to be resistance. And you can look at Scott and Jaffe, there's a deny and resist as like the first two stages of every new information that's coming out. And then there's exploration and commitment. But it's not just like you're going to say, oh, this is what the reality is, and be like, oh, okay, I'm going to accept that now. It's like a battle. It's a war. And Marilyn Schlitz, she used to be the president of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and I did an interview with her at the IONS conference a couple years ago, and she said, one of the core competencies of the 21st century is being able to embrace paradox. And I think this is like a profound statement, because it is saying that we need to actually enjoy that cognitive dissonance of having our worldview messed with. We need ontological pluralism when we're able to accommodate many different perspectives, many different worldviews, whether it's indigenous perspectives or African American, African, Latin American, Eastern, Chinese, like all of the different philosophies. When you go to a philosophy conference, it's just like analytic versus continental. And it's like, well, what about everything else? Like, there's so many different philosophies that doesn't fit into that Western paradigm. And so how can you create a philosophy that's a little bit more inclusive of all the different perspectives? And that's a lot of it what I've been trying to work with at the Voices of VR podcast is, like, what is that framework to be able to accommodate these multitude and plurality of different perspectives? So Kohlberg has these different stages of moral development, where there's kind of like different, essentially it's you go from your sense of self, and then your sense of family, and then community, and other, and the world, and the cosmos. You're more and more, you're having more encompassing of your scope of identity is that you're identifying with more and more larger scopes of identity. And that the stages of moral development are kind of essentially going through those different steps and different stages. And there's another theory of spiral dynamics, which essentially is saying the same thing around worldviews, which you have these different kind of like progressions. And Ken, if anybody's familiar with Ken Wilber, he's leveraged a lot of the spiral dynamics. But the idea is that you transcend the limitations of one level and include the sort of plurality of the benefit that you're getting from the expanded worldview, and that you just keep going through that process, but that you have this iteration between either focusing on yourself or the individual or the collective, and you kind of have this process of like focusing on just yourself, and then you start to follow all the rules and laws of the fundamental Christianity, or then back into capitalism, and then back into sort of more of an egalitarian ecological perspective, and then the more spiritual integrative self. And so you kind of are flipping back and forth into this dialectic, this Hegelian dialectic between the self and other, as you kind of go through this process of trying to shift back between the self and the other and integrate those processes. And so I like to think of like the difference between waterfall and agile, where you are going through this iterative process of trying to integrate and expand your worldview. And Arthur Koestler has this concept of the holon, which is that each individual like atom is a part of the molecule, and it just sort of goes up into more and more structures of complexity, but the individual is embedded within the context of the whole. And so you don't have this separation between the individual and the whole, but it's all intimately connected. So what if paradigm diffusion is very similar to technology diffusion, where you have something like the Gartner hype cycle, where you have these emerging technologies, and then you have the peak of the hype cycle, and then it goes down into the trough of disillusionment and the slope of enlightenment. You have this sort of process and this iteration where new technology and the potential of what it is, and then it actually takes a lot of pragmatic work to make it work. So the potential is always higher than what the reality is, but then you have this process of change over time. And Simon Wardley had this model where he says that first there's an idea of a genesis, and then it gets into a custom bespoke application in the enterprise, and then at some point there's a consumer product, and then eventually that consumer product becomes a commodity and just it's mass ubiquitous. And so in some ways this is what immersive technologies are on this roadmap. From that idea to the enterprise applications, into the products, the consumer products, and into being a mass commodity. And you have the first wave of technology, so we still have the initial waves of the first Oculus PC, and then you have the Rift come out, and then you have the next iteration. So it's kind of like this unending sort of iterations of cycles. And then the Rogers diffusion model, where you have it go out into the audience, but you have the innovators, early adopters, early majority, and that's what people are familiar with, is that crossing the chasm into the mainstream, where it's the new ideas and concepts are always in the small group, and then eventually they get dispersed out into the majority. And what if worldviews are like that as well? What if there's a similar kind of like center of gravity of different worldviews, and then there's a diffusion process that happens? And this is, I think, in some ways controversial just because it sort of implies that there's a hierarchy and that one worldview is better than the other. And then, I argue in some ways maybe that's true in the sense like if you are only focusing on yourself and you're going to destroy the planet, then there's a tragedy of commons issue there where we have to resolve that we actually have to like have a worldview that accommodates. And so there is this kind of scope of identity of like trying to have worldviews that are more and more inclusive in that way. So maybe there is a hierarchy because there's the destruction of the planet that's happening. So we need to figure out the ways to deal with that. And then there's a question of like, how much can we transform other people? We can transform ourselves, and we have agency over that, but how much can we really expect to change people? I think this is a legitimate question, is like, as we're thinking about games for change and XR for change, what is that process? What is the model to change other people? And how do we encourage people to get into this process and path of wanting to change themselves? So again, every immersive experience that's created is a philosophical argument for change. So I'm just going to go through briefly this experiential design framework. I've talked about it in other talks. I only have a few minutes here to kind of quickly cover it, but this is a talk that I've given for 40 to 50 minutes, and so I'm just going to go through. So I say there's 4 major dimensions of an experience. There's the quality of an experience, the context of the experience, the character of experience, and the story of an experience. So the quality of an experience. So I see that there's active presence and mental social presence, embodied presence, and emotional presence. And you can kind of think about how there's, and by the way, all these slides, if you go to my Twitter, @KentBuy, I've already uploaded all the slides if you want to look at them, since I'm going to be going through this part a little quickly. But, so making choices, taking action, a video game, being able to communicate through abstractions, through the internet and social media, those are all expressing your energy outward. The sense of embodied presence of your body in the film is the emotional presence and embodied presence. And in some ways, there's a convergence of all these. So how do you take the elements of making choices and taking action in a video game and blend it with this narrative storytelling of a film? And I think that's the crux of a lot of what we'll be hearing about here at this conference. But looking at the elements, it's this spectrum between hot, cold, and wet and dry. So maybe the qualities are always this polarity point between some sort of qualitative extreme between hot, cold, wet, and dry. And that's how the elements are kind of defined by Aristotle. But you have the more hot, or your agencies are going outward in some ways, and the cold it's more receptive. And the wet is more of the emotional connectivity of engagement, but also connecting to other people. So you have this sort of social dimension and emotional dimension, but also the more dry. So again, you get back to this individual and the collective. And I'm very inspired by Chinese philosophy of the yang and the yin, because I think those, as metaphors, really describe that polarity, and that it's really about trying to create a balance. It's not about doing one or the other, but it's trying to strike a balance of the ingredients of the experience that has a combination. And so either energy is either going outward or inward, is giving or receiving, talking or listening. So context. So what is the ultimate potential of VR? This is the sort of cartography of human context that I got from the different answers. But also I think it's a model for ethical and moral design. So moral frameworks to be able to understand the context and the different domains of human experience. At the Laval Virtual, we did this whole brainstorm trying to list out all the ethical and moral dilemmas of mixed reality, and we had this whole spreadsheet or just all these Post-it notes. And so then I said, well, what if we took it and try to mash it up with this cartography of human experience and then sort of see how those come together? And then we presented that at Laval Virtual, and then at the Augmented World Expo, I actually just went through and did a whole 50-minute talk of elaborating on how this could be used as a kind of ethical and moral framework, and that'll be a video that'll come out soon. But these are the different domains of human experience. So I think context is interesting because in some ways, augmented reality and virtual reality, with AR, you're able to modify the context. So you're in the center of gravity of the context, but you're putting additional context onto it. And in VR, you're completely switching into a different context. So what's that mean to be at home and now you're at work? We already do that to some extent with our phones, but now you're completely immersed in that environment. And you're able to do that to a certain extent with AR. So I think in AR, you're able to sort of shift and modulate the context, but not completely alter it. Although that's debatable, you might be able to do that. We'll see where it all goes. So what is context? I think it's like shared experience and language and history and values and worldviews and beliefs and your idea of what reality is and causality and who the heroes and enemies are, culture, different age groups and gender and ability, education, race, ethnicity, origin, religion. I think context is like, to try to pin it down is very difficult because it's so much different stuff, but I feel like it's a crucial part of what you're able to do with this medium is to create a context. So character and, I think character and story, the last two parts, there's nothing that I've seen so far in XR that's really innovated here, but I would just say that we could take some insights from like depth psychological perspectives to see what your character is in terms of different personality tests, what is like your center of gravity of your personality, looking at different moral virtues to see how there's different virtues of a character and how there's a spectrum of that. And if you look at something like Westworld and you look at AI, the future of character is going to be all these different dimensions of these different aspects of a character. And it's going to be the process of creating an AI is about creating these characters that are very rich and compelling and nuanced and complex and real. And then finally, the story is the difference between, I'd say, the story is how that changes over time. So you have a character, but then that character goes through some sort of change. And so we've typically looked at the hero's journey from Campbell as this going out in this hero's journey. I'd say that's the yang archetypal journey. But I actually think that there's a new yin archetypal journey that is maybe we get some insights from Eastern stories and philosophy, which is where the yang is much more about ego individuation, and the yin is much more about ego disillusionment. It's about you seeing how you're connected to a larger whole. And it's more about you being present, being embodied, and having this embodied experience. And what's that mean to have a yin archetypal journey? I think that's something that we are going to start to be exploring with this medium. But I think it's in some ways, one is linear and one is cyclical. One is about chronos time, that is very linear and unending and marching, and about the fatedness of reality, and the other is about kairos time, that's about the quality of the moment, it's about being present, about being connected to this moment, how it relates to the past, and to be able to see how there's a cyclical nature of kairos time. And then moving from a more monochronic, linear, hierarchical mindset of monochronic into the more sort of distributed, nonlinear, polychronic, so many different cycles that are happening all at once, all at the same time. So whereas like there's one story in a hero's journey, there's many different stories that are unfolding at many different cycles, at many different layers, at many different, so if you want to come back again and again to a story, then you want to see something that changes over a day, changes over a month, changes over a year. You have to have a lot more sophisticated modeling of how those cycles are unfolding. So you can look at different spatial metaphors for how those cycles may be all coming together by having these different ratios that this kind of represents different cycles at different spaces. So those are the 4 dimensions of experience: the quality of the experience, the context of the experience, the character of experience, and the story of experience. And you can sort of see here different visual metaphors for that. So finally, today I was able to talk to you about some of the transformative VR experiences that I've been through, a little bit of a model of what is transformation, and then finally, a little bit of my own experiential design framework. And if you want more information, you can follow me on my podcast, the Voices of VR podcast. We're having more interviews and different talks like this, as well as on Twitter @KentBuy. So thank you very much.